Good evening, everyone. I think there must be some kind of legal requirement that when you have a discussion about families, you have to begin with the Tolstoy quote, that happy families are all alike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. If you substitute Jewish for unhappy, every Jewish family is Jewish in its own way, which is, I think, one of the things we're going to discuss tonight. Two of our panellists have relatively recent memoirs out of their families. And one of the things that I think is most striking about both David and Howard's memoirs is just how different their families are. I don't know if any of you have read them, but that's one of the most striking things. But also, for all their strangeness in some ways, there is so much that resonates with anybody who's Jewish. You just get what they're writing about. And apart from anything else, they're also hysterically funny. I was just saying before to Howard, I read Howard's book on my own, when I was on my own, and I was just kind of like corpsed up with laughter. But I made the terrible mistake the last few days of reading David's book on a plane. And I think the people next to me thought I was having some kind of fit because I was sort of corpsed up with laughter. Claudia's books, I think if you laughed at them, it would have been the wrong reaction to them. Claudia's books, of course, are absolutely iconic, as is Claudia. Not just her seminal book about Jewish food, but so many others. And they all have in them this whole notion of family, whether it's explicit or whether it's within whether it's sort of kind of buried within the text that they're writing about. And I thought what we'd do is start, just so that you know what the format will be, we'll chat amongst ourselves for a while, and then I'll open it up to questions so that everyone's got the chance to put their questions or this being a Jewish audience, long speeches to the panel. I thought we'd start with a general discussion though. What do you think makes Jewish families different from others? Maybe, Howard, do you want to give us your kind of like opening thoughts on that?
I don't like having opening thoughts. I like having thoughts in relation to other people's thoughts.
Then a specific question.
You've asked me. And I met a rabbi. I was going to say a Jewish rabbi. There aren't any other kind. I met an American rabbi recently who said, I don't think it's God that makes us Jewish. I think it's family that makes us Jewish. And really, in the history of Jewishness, it's family that we revere, and it's family that makes us the thing we are. That is certainly the case with me. I've, insofar as I've made a living, I make a living out of being Jewish. I don't really do anything else now. I just think about being Jewish. When I was a little bit more active, I played table tennis, which is, of course, a Jewish sport, because your parents don't want... When my mother first saw a football, she said, "Oh, yeah, Brock, you're not going anywhere near that. Is there any game with a smaller ball?" So I was allowed to play table tennis. So I played table tennis, which was Jewish. I studied English literature at Cambridge, which was very Jewish. And now I write Jewish novels and talk to Jewish people and appear on panels like this. I am entirely Jewish, and I know nothing whatsoever about Judaism. I don't go to shul. I'm frightened of shul. I don't practice anything. I wore tzitzis for a day. I put tefillin on for an hour. I absolutely hate all that. And yet I love being Jewish. And the Jewishness that I loved was absolutely the Jewishness of family. I was born in the war, and my father was away, not fighting, but should have been fighting. I don't mean he did deserted, he just was not fit enough to fight. And I was brought up by my mother was young when she had me, she was 18. So here I am now in the world and she's 19. And she's got a 17-year-old sister and a mother that's not much older than them. And these three really quite young women brought me up. None of them knew anything about being Jewish, but they were entirely Jewish, and the affection in which I was bathed was entirely Jewish, and they exaggerated things that they said about me. For example, my mother used to say, "Darling, you've got such long legs, you're going to be a dancer." Now, only a Jewish mother could get that quite so wrong about a short son. us are that big. And it was Jewish affection. It was the sense of being bathed in Jewish affection that gave me my affection, which I felt back, for Jews. This went wrong. I'm not going to talk about this now, but this went wrong when I was 4 and a baby brother was born. And that really is, essentially, that's the next thing that makes my life. 3 Jewish women bringing me up, and then 3 Jewish women telling me to bugger off because they'd found another one to look after. So that gave me all those things that you necessarily need as a creative person. Envy, really. It gave me envy. And without envy, you don't get anywhere as an artist. You certainly don't get anywhere as a writer. And I'm not sure you don't get anywhere as a Jew, because envy is such a powerful emotion. You know, if you've got a brain in your head, you dare not give into it, and you have to laugh at yourself. And the gift of laughing at yourself is, of course, the thing that we most have, most need, never needed it more. We need to laugh at other people too. We need to laugh very strenuously at other people, but we need to laugh at ourselves. And it's the affection of your mother that teaches that. My father was away in the war, but when my father came back, I must have been, he saw me when I was a little baby, but I didn't see him much until I was about 3 or 4, and he decided that I was being spoilt by these women, so he bought me a pair of boxing gloves and knocked me out in the garden. We boxed in the garden, and as you would imagine, this upset my mother and my grandmother and my auntie, but that also gave me, once I recovered, that also gave me a sense of the ludicrousness of life. That's a start.
It's a very good start, thank you. Claudia, what do you think?
Yes. Well, I knew we were Jewish. We were a very close-knit community in Egypt. But we were all very different, because all the Jews there at the community, or at least most of them, because there had been some who had been there since time immemorial, but otherwise we were Jews from all around the Ottoman world and around the Mediterranean who had come to Egypt in the 19th century. And we were different, but we had a lot in common. We were cosmopolitan, I would say, because we spoke many languages, but we were also mainly from Muslim countries. So we were what we called ourselves des Juifs orientaux. We spoke French at home, and we were Oriental Jews. Now here we are called Sephardi and Mizrahi. Actually, the word Mizrahi means Egyptian. I don't know why they call all the Arab Jews Egyptian, but this is what it's become. And we had a very strong view of who we were. In my family, we were very strongly Syrian, because 3 of my grandparents had come at the end of the 19th century. Actually, they came when my father when my grandmother was pregnant of my father, and he arrived and was born in Cairo. And they came to live in a district that had just been built. It was called Sakakini, and they were all Jews from Syria, mainly living there. And they continued to live as though they were Jews from Syria. They were still in Syria, in their way of life and the way they spoke and the way they cooked. And yes, what else did I want to say? A whole lot of things. I'm sorry, I have senior moments every so often. But yes, on the other side, we felt we were very European. In my immediate family, we felt Syrian. We followed all the codes of Syria, of Syrian Jews, and we also felt European and very French, because one of my grandmothers, who was from Istanbul, was Judeo-Spanish speaker, but she had been a teacher of the Alliance Israélite-Française that brought an organization, an educational organization, that brought French to all the Jewish communities, not only of the Muslim world, Ottoman world, but on the wide world as well. And she had become like a missionary of French. And when my father asked my mother in marriage, she had only agreed if we did not speak Arabic at home, because my father was Arabic speaking. So yes, we had all these multiple identities and multiple cultures. We did feel grandly Jewish. We felt we was a Jewish elite because my great-grandfather had been the chief rabbi of Aleppo. I was going to bring a photograph of him because all my relatives everywhere in the world have that photograph. And I keep getting emails now with that photograph in the email saying, I'm related to you. And some of them say, my grandmother gave you a recipe. And have you got a recipe for rosquette now? Actually, rosquette is what I call kahk. In Arabic, it's kahk. In Judeo-Spanish, it was rosquette. I got an email recently from Sao Paulo, somebody saying, I'm a chef and I'm related to you. And I said, how? And he said, oh no, before I asked him how, he said, do you know, I forget what the name was, Russo. I said, no. And then he said, do you know Émilie Rafoul? Yes, Émilie Rafoul was my aunt, my father's sister. And he said, Émilie is my great-grandmother. So you see all the age differences. So yes, the grandmother who was this missionary of France married my grandfather, who was Isaac Sassoon. We found out only when we came here that the Sassoons were important. We knew he was important because he was very much respected in the business world. They were all merchants. He also had come from Syria, but he was one of the Sassoons who went to Syria. They went from Iraq to India, and in India he had got a British passport. And so my mother got a British passport because of that. And this is why we were allowed to settle here. Because a lot of people who left Egypt in 1956 and arrived as refugees weren't able to stay. And they were all looking for where to go. And they dispersed all over the place. And yes, we had my identity was a very happy identity, because for me, family was extended family. We were the kind of family where my father was one of 10. He was the only son and the last one with 9 girls. And my mother was one of 6 and girls, or rather there were 5 girls and the last one was a boy. And but they all had lots of children as well. So one of my aunts, my father's sister, had 18 children. So almost everybody we knew, I thought, was my cousin. But so it was happy. But it's when we came here that my parents felt we were very different. Because they came to live, because my mother had a British passport, we were given £5,000 in compensation for having been thrown out of Egypt. And they put it as a mortgage in a house in Golders Green, where we invited all the refugees. And for 10 years, we were just a house full of refugees coming for a short while for a Friday night or friends. But as soon as they came to the house, neighbors came, knocked at the door and said, "We're from next door. We know you're refugees. You came from Egypt." They came with flowers and said, "We are Jewish." And so my mother said, "Don't come in now. We can only receive you when we've got food. I'm sorry." And so they came 2 days later. And my mother spent so much time, and myself helping, to prepare all these little things for tea, including hummus, stuffed vines, filo pastries, a whole lot of things. And when they came, they looked at us in total shock. And one of them said, "Are you sure you're Jewish?"
That's brilliant.
Is it me?
Yes, it's you.
You sure there's any time left? Hello, everybody. Strange to be here. Why not a JW3? I can't understand it. Why come to a rugby ground, the most Yorkshire sport? Football, not a Yorkshire sport. That's wrong, how it's said. But yeah, rugby.
Football is a total Yorkshire sport. You're just pretending, that's all.
3 Lions, written by 2 Jews and a cat. Completely wrong. But lovely to hear extended monologues by Claudia and Howard. I'll try and keep it a bit shorter. I can't remember what the question was, but I think it was something about what makes Jewish families Jewish. And obviously,
yes.
There's many different things that come back to, I guess, the same kind of nodes. But talking about my own family, there was obvious Jewishness and then less obvious Jewishness. And so the obvious Jewishness was my mum was a refugee from the Nazis, and my dad was Welsh and working class, but going back a couple of generations, he would have been, or not him, but his great-grandfather would have been escaping from pogroms in Russia. This is probably an apocryphal story, but pretty Jewish, which is that, as far as I understand it, my great-great-grandfather on that side got on a timber boat in Latvia, thinking he was going to New York. The boat stopped to refuel or something on Swansea, not speaking any English or Welsh. He got out. 10 years later, he'd learned enough English to say, "Where is the Statue of Liberty?" And so they were stuck in Swansea. And and I had a very Jewish element to my early childhood, which was nothing to do with us being properly Orthodox, but because I lived in Cricklewood, which in 1970 was quite hard, the only place where a Jewish kid, and there were 3 of us, wouldn't get beaten up was the Northwest London Jewish Day School. And so I went there, and that was a very religious school. I went with tzitzit, not just a yarmulke. Tzitzit, I learned Hebrew. Every meal was kosher. Grace after meals, I learned to speak or read Hebrew. And all this is going on while in the morning my dad is making me bacon sandwiches. So it's a contradiction, essentially, is what I'm saying there. But all this is sort of obviously Jewish. Less obviously Jewish, which is kind of the centre of this book, is that my mum was meanwhile having an affair with a golfing memorabilia collector and becoming obsessed with golfing memorabilia, an incredibly un-Jewish sport, of course, because it barred Jews from most golf clubs, or secretly, or sometimes not so secretly, until about sort of the mid-70s. So an incredibly English, racist, clubbable sport, which was probably involved in why my mother became obsessed with it, because she was a refugee from the Nazis, and at some level this represented a type of acceptance to her. And interestingly enough, there's a moment I talk about in this book where I'm on a programme called Baddiel and Skinner Unplanned, and my mother has decided to join me on stage, which is a very my mother thing to do, and she's sitting there, and she refers, again in a very my mother way, to the fact that I am one of 3. She's very keen to say to the audience, it's not just him, that he's got 2 brothers, and they all go, "Ah," the audience, because she's being so mummish. And I say, "I don't know why you're going, that just means that my mum had sex with my dad 3 times. And she says, "How do you know they were all from your father?" which is an incredible thing to say out loud with my dad in the audience on national TV. But very much my mother, who defied the Jewish mother stereotype of being like sexually a bit repressed. She was sexually incredibly unrepressed and liked to broadcast her sex life. And I said, which I regret now, I said to her when she said that thing about having sex, how do you know they were all from your father? I said, that's not a comeback to me, mother, that's calling yourself a slag. I regret that now, but she topped me anyway because she said, and this is the Jewish bit, I think, in a very interesting way, she said, no, it means I had a good life. And I think that's very moving because I think what she meant, perhaps unconsciously, and my mother was always trying to do this, I think, was that my mother, had Hitler never existed, would have had a gilded life, because my mother was from a very rich family in a place called Königsberg in East Prussia. They owned a brick factory, they had servants. My cousin Michael tells me they had a Rubens, which I don't know if it's true. I'm pissed off if they did, because that should be mine now. But it's all gone, and they're coming to London penniless, and then my grandfather is interned on the Isle of Man, and my mother ends up with this angry Welsh working class bloke, and somewhere in her mind is the Austrian prince that she should have married. And she can't get near him. The nearest she can get is a golfing memorabilia collector. So when my mother says, no, it shows I had a good life, I think it means it shows I had the good life, the one that was stolen from me, I think. And I think that's deeply, deeply Jewish, but in a very buried way, much more so than going to a place where I had to wear tzitzit and yarmulke.
Can I just ask, David, whether you ever discovered if your father was Jewish or not?
My father's Jewish.
Because you said...
Oh, you mean the lover? My lover is not my father. Although, can I just tell you something?
How do you know that?
Because I look exactly like my dad, who's Jewish. I look totally like my dad.
Well, I met your mother, and I thought you looked very much like your mother.
Yes, I look like my mum as well. I mean, it was definitely my mother who gave birth to me. But I'm also, I am my dad's son. I'm not sure about my younger brother, but don't tell me.
This is at the same time both the most Jewish and the most un-Jewish conversation I've ever heard.
But can I just tell you something?
But if you didn't have a Jewish father, it would explain this footballing thing.
No. My father was Jewish and a big football fan. But I just must tell you something.
Well, you don't know what he had. Did he have a Jewish father?
Yes, he's the one with the great-grandfather running from Russian pogroms. That's my dad, Colin Baddiel. Totally Jewish. I'm totally Jewish. I've got the BRCA gene. Definitely. 4 grandparents. Anyway.
I don't want to go on about this, but you do protest a lot about how
I do. You're the one who just said you're a professional Jew.
Yeah, but I don't. And my mother didn't tell me she'd had 15 lovers and I might have been the son of any one of them.
That's because every Jewish family is different. Anyway, I'm
not going to say mine was a respectable Jewish family. Because, in fact, I do have a mother's story, a misbehaving mother's story.
Can I just tell
Yes, of course.
Just another, which is, I don't know if he's here tonight, I doubt he is, unless he's become a stalker. But I did an event talking about my memoir at a school in Northwood or somewhere the other day. And a guy stood up in the audience. And I have been talking about this facet of my mum and her life and golf for a while. I did a show in the West End about it and blah, blah, blah. And this guy stood up, and I should have twigged it, but I didn't. He said, oh, have you ever met, the guy's called David White. That's the golfing member. Have you ever met any members of David White's family? I said, well, David White I met. He tried to teach me how to play golf, right? Incredibly transgressively, because we like football, and how Yorkshire is that? Inside our back garden, he tried to teach me how to play golf. And I said, no one else. I said, his half-sister wrote to me while I was in the West End, and actually he spoke about what a terrible wanker she did. The half-sister, his brother was, because he used to exploit women, and he was a bit of a con man, and blah, blah, blah. It's about the most negative I've ever been about that bloke. And then that guy, who stood up, said, well, we may be half-brothers, because I'm... It's true, he did, and said, because I'm Ian White. And I thought, oh, God. And so I invited him upstage and gave him a hug. He's a slightly too frantic hug he gave me. And, yeah, so that's the first time I've met this bloke who is the son of my mother's lover, which is quite a thing.
Anyone here want to want to top that? Since this is a Jewish discussion, obviously the first thing we're going to talk about properly, as it were, is food. One of my minor kind of theories is that one of the reasons Jews are so disputatious and we're so argumentative as a tribe, as it were, is the way we eat. and the family meals, and I mean, there's that wonderful scene that you mentioned in your book, David. There's that wonderful scene in Annie Hall when the Woody Allen character's taken to his non-Jewish girlfriend's Easter meal, I think it is, and they're all sitting there very quietly and complimenting the mother on the food, and then it cuts to Woody Allen wearing, a black hat and tzitzit and everything, as how they perceive him as this, and the fact that Jewish meals are so very different. And one of the things that really struck me about that you mentioned in your book, Howard, is the fact that you never ate together as a family. I find that, to me, if you asked me what's the single most defining thing about my upbringing as a Jew, I would say it's, not as a sitcom title, Friday Night Dinner.
But we never sat down.
You never sat down?
But we ate standing, some sitting down and some standing up in the same kitchen.
Right.
But also, I think I now have to put you right about something. The truth is, we never ate. What we did was we drank food. The food was so soft. You could eat what the food that we bought or my mother prepared. You could take through a straw. And it was only in the end when we were checked by the school dentists and discovered, and we were told that our teeth was falling out because we'd never chewed anything. It was just, we ate Smetana and Kes, which comes up through a straw. We had mushed bagel, which comes up through a straw. So then the doctors told my mother, you're going to have to make some proper food. And she didn't know how to make proper food. So she went out and bought tins of beef, kosher beef and things. And she didn't know how to cook, so she'd put them in a pan. She'd put these tins in a pan and boil the tin in a pan. And then we'd be all busy talking about this, that and the other, and the pan would boil dry. And she never punctured the can. She didn't know how to do that. So the cans then started to rattle in the pan, made this terrific noise. And occasionally, the pans would then explode. And the food would go up onto the ceiling. It's only recently that my mother died, having lived in the family house for a very long time, and there was still food that she prepared for us in 1958. It wasn't a filthy house, don't get me wrong, but because my father cleaned it, he never got to the ceiling, so the food was on the ceiling. So that's my experience of Jewish food.
I have to say, when I was young, what I would have given to have food that was liquid. My grandma on my father's side, we used to have this meal that, when I was a kid, was always referred to as baked dinner. What it meant was chicken, lokshen, and so on, that had been dried in the oven to such an extent that there was not a slightest hint of moisture in it. So we used to have to carve at it. And
my mum was like that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, Claudia, because I don't think I knew what nice food was until I was about 15. Because my mum was, I think the notion that you create a notion that Jewish women, Jewish mothers are good cooks, and many of them are, not my mother. She would basically cook meat absolutely as hard as a brick. Like, there's no notion of rare. And no notion really of even well done, like well beyond well done. And then she made chicken soup, but that was like an enormous vat of water in which she would throw the odd claw. Right? And it's barley, a lot of barley in it, but no notion seemed to be of sort of stock or flavouring or anything like that. So the food was mainly terrible.
Had you tried drinking that soup through a straw? You'd have liked it. The straw improves the taste of watery soup.
I'll tell you a moment that did happen once. My grandma, so my mother, as I said, was a refugee from the Nazis, and she was an only child, and she got out with her parents. Everyone else in her family was murdered. And Otti and Ernst lived in Cambridge, and Otti was not a bad cook. She was quite a good cook. But she had this strange thing, which is she was very aware of the Jewishness of her food. And my first girlfriend was Jewish. Her name was Janine Kaufman, and straightforwardly, she was Jewish. But for some reason, Otti couldn't quite grasp that. And I remember taking Janine to Otti's house in Cambridge, and she served up this very nice chicken soup and knedlach. Very nice, but she was convinced that Janine wasn't Jewish. So that when she put the plate down, she said, I don't know if you'll like this, it's very continental.
Claudia, am I right in having the impression from your books that, in contrast to what we've just been talking about...
I'd like to say something. In Egypt, yes, we had... the idea of Ashkenazi food was...
Yes.
And we had ways of saying, gnedelig, or kreppelig. We'd never touch it.
But did you have these? I mean, I have this impression that you would have these wonderful kind of family feasts.
Yes.
Oh.
It was all table. All the photographs we have are all round the table. And
Are you sure you're Jewish?
yes, that's the Sephardim and Mizrahi.
Yeah.
Sephardi Jew.
Yeah.
And yes, it was. But one thing that when I was testing the recipes, the Jewish recipes, I was always inviting people to test them, to say what they think. And we kept changing and doing. But once we had people who came and they said, where would we be able to find all these dishes that you have? They were all dishes, home cooking, of the Sephardim from Lebanon, from Syria, from Morocco, and I just said, you can't go in a restaurant and find this food. You have to be invited in a Jewish family. But actually now, every restaurant you go to, there it is, the food of Sephardi Jews, because of Yotam, because of Honey and Co.
Because of you.
Yeah, but can I actually, so to get slightly serious for a minute, in my book, Jews Don't Count, one of the first things I note is to do with food. Because the people, you will have heard of this phenomenon, cultural appropriation. And cultural appropriation normally means, for a progressive person, that someone has taken a culture that is not theirs and made it there. It normally applies to the sort of notion that white people have somehow taken Mexican culture or whatever else it might be and colonised it in some way. This is a very bad thing for progressives, etc., and should never happen, except as regards Jewish food. It's interesting. Like, Jewish food has completely been taken by non-Jews all over the world, and we're fine with that. And you can find bagels and chopped liver and herring and all sorts of Jewish food taken away, and it's fine. But you cannot find on the internet, try it, any sort of rage at all about Jewish food being culturally appropriated by non-Jews. All you can find, of course, is rage at Jews for taking away Palestinian food. That's what you do see. That you do see quite a lot of people saying this should not be considered Jewish food, etc., etc. And it's a very good example of Jews not counting that issue around food.
It's not true.
Thank you. Oh, it's not true.
It's
apparently.
not true.
What I just said
because,
not true.
No, because the Palestinians have taken the Jewish food.
No, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I agree.
No, because
I'm saying that
Palestinian did. They weren't the best cuisine. Actually, I did write the introduction of the first Palestinian cookbook.
Did you?
And also I went to Frankfurt Book Fair with the Gaza cookbook.
Did you?
Yes.
Really?
When was promote
that?
it.
When was that?
A few years ago.
A few years ago.
It's a very good book.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
But that's really interesting
and we
that you did that.
promoted it. Yeah, and it was
So
only...
Palestinians took... Because I know somebody who claims that Hamas is named after hummus. Would this be?
No, but yes, because I was part of a discussion on Zoom about the Palestinians complaining that the Jews were
stealing their food.
Yotam was on. There were several Jewish. We were all on Zoom, and it was doing the thing. And the Palestinian woman who wrote a big book now that done by Fiden, and then she said, Claudia, we all use your book. Because there was no Middle Eastern cookbook in Palestine or Israel. This one was in Hebrew, was the first one.
So on top of all the other things we did for that country, we took them food.
Yeah.
And this is the thanks we get.
Let's come back to the meals that you would eat. So, or the meals that you would drink standing up, and the rock hard food that you would eat. Forget the method of eating. Am I right in thinking that you would have I was talking about the argumentativeness of meals. I mean, our Friday night dinners would, if I brought a school friend back, they'd think that that the family had fallen out or something, that we were screaming at each other. To me, it was just like a perfectly pleasant conversation.
Yeah.
And to me, that's an archetypal Jewish experience. Is that how either of you experienced eating, as it were, as part of your family?
Well, my dad in general was the angriest man in the world. I think at his funeral, I said that my dad was a man who liked food, football, and shouting, "Who the fucking hell is this now?" every time the phone rang. And he was a man of just... a man of just endless irritation. When he got Pick's disease, which is a type of dementia, the Pick's disease is a frontal lobe dementia, and it's characterised by behavioural changes, including disinhibition, irritation, laziness, a tendency to obscenity. And I said to the neurologist, "Sorry, does he have a disease or have you just met him?" And I mean, he was entirely furious all the time. So I don't know if it was more around food. In fact, my dad also was a man of catchphrases. Like, this was something that was kind of moving later in life, because if you have a relative with dementia, you're always trying to find them again. You're always trying to dig them out of the dementia at some level to check that they're in there somewhere. And so my dad, because he was a man of catchphrases, whenever, if you were to leave my dad's house and you would say, "I'm off," he would always say, "You've been off for years," for example. And latterly, we would try to get him to say that. And I remember once being in the pub with him, which we didn't go to very often because we're Jewish, but we were in the pub. And
Football you can play, the pub you can't go to.
It was unusual that we were in the pub, I agree with that. That was a bit weird. But I was trying to get him to say one of these catchphrases as a reassurance. And eventually I tried this one. I said, "Have you got a match?" And he just said no. And I said, "No, have you got a match?" And he just looked at me. And eventually I tried it one more time. I said, "Dad, have you got a match?" And he said, "Yes, your face and my arse." Yeah. And that was brilliant, because it meant that he was still in there somewhere. Anyway, all of this is in the service of the fact that, despite the fact that my mum was a terrible cook, the only time I ever saw my dad kind of satisfied and replete was after eating. And he would always say, "I feel almost human." That was his catchphrase at that point. And we would all say, this was like a vaudeville thing, "Why are you not completely human?" And he would say, "Because then you buggers would be asking me for money." I don't know why that was the drill, but that was what we always said. So he was only ever happy after eating.
And what about Howard? What about your family?
Well,
gatherings?
I now realise what a nice family I came from. My father was a very nice, sweet man. The thing I most remember about him around food was if we went to a restaurant, he never got enough food. He was short and very wide. He was wider than he was tall, my father. He was a Ukrainian, and my mother was Lithuanian. He was a Ukrainian. That's another story, because Ukrainian Jews and Lithuanian Jews got on very badly. But and it meant I was born in the middle of this war, really, between different kind of Jews. But they didn't fight that much. But he could never get enough food, and he would always, whenever we went anywhere, he would order double of everything. So it was always, if we went, he loved curries, so it was always, "I'd like a chicken vindaloo with extra biryani, please," or biryani with extra vindaloo. A drink was always a lager with extra lime. But for someone who liked eating so much, not drinking alcohol, there was no alcohol in the house at all. Just Polwins, you'll remember Polwins. Just a little bit of Polwins. And if I ever brought a bottle of wine back into the house, stupid enough to bring a bottle of wine back in, my mother would say, "I hope it's sweet." I said, it's red, but I hope it's sweet. I just hope it's sweet. But for someone who had these gargantuan appetites, there was one wonderful thing my father did at the deli. Sunday morning was going to the bagel shop and buying all the stuff, the roll mops and the schmaltz herring and all that. But he had a speciality, which was Smetana and Kes. So Kes was the cream cheese, and Smetana was, a sour cream. And you mix Smetana and Kes, which is a way of making, you get cheese, and you buy cheese, and you mix them together, and you get more cheese. And my father just loved this, and he did it with such, his fingers, he had this great big thick, he was a magician, my father, and his fingers were a kid's magician, who never did a trick right in his life, but the kids, and he had fingers as thick as 3 of my fingers, so he could never do a trick. But these fingers suddenly became attenuated and beautiful when he started to make this dish. And he just looked a different man, and he would mix it with extraordinary finesse, because he knew you have to know, if you're going to do smetana and Kes, you've got to know exactly how much smetana to put in the Kes. Too much smetana in the Kes, and you've just got a bowl of smetana. Not enough smetana, and you've just got Kes. And he would do this beautiful, and I'm telling you, smetana and Kes on a bagel, there has never been anything like it. Never. I'm sorry for you all that you never I'm certainly sorry for your father that he never would have made a sweeter man of him had he only tasted this. But there wasn't that kind of shouting in our house. We didn't do that. We just didn't do that. There was a lot of noise and a lot of expostulation. And the expostulation, which wasn't food related, was always my mother saying, "Oh, you're never going to believe it. Oh, you're never going to believe this." And I think, what? And it would be, someone's moved in next door. Oh, right. Never believe this. And my father had no words. My father never read a book. When he read the first of my books, he said, "Can I just hold on to this for a few weeks?" And he held on to it, and I'd see him peering. And he didn't get past the ISBN number page. He said, "I realise what this is all about now. You identify a book with numbers." I said, "Yeah, but have you read anything that's in the book?" "I'll get round to that later." Never, ever did. He had no words. My mother was all words. So he would just sit back and let my mother run our life with words. It was, in its own way, it's making me very upset. I'm realising how much I loved it. It worked very, very well. And I gravitated towards my mother, because she was the word person who read me poetry. And my father would just sit in an armchair and then fall asleep, because he'd eaten too much smetana and Kes. And just schmeichel. My father's word for, you have schmeichel. My father, did you have schmeichel?
Yeah.
Egyptians had schmeichel. My father would just schmeichel at the idea that my mother was clever, and that I was clever, and that we would talk together, and he perfectly happily sat it out.
Let's talk about your mother. Let's talk about the Jewish mother. There's a line in your book, Howard, where you quote a psychologist as saying the reason for the intense relationship between Jewish mothers and their sons is guilt over circumcision, which I thought was a particularly, it sounded amusing, but actually I think the more I thought about it, the more I thought maybe there's something in that. But
something in it. I won't take up any more time, but I'll just say it goes like this. The son is circumcised, the mother can't bear to see it, the father is holding the child is circumcised, the father faints, the child falls on the floor, the mother picks up this bleeding child. She thinks, why haven't I done anything to stop this? The milk dries in her breasts. This is the theory. The milk never dried in my mother's breast. I had so much milk, I was ungestopped with milk. But the theory is that the milk dries in the breasts, and the mother is guilty for this.
So what theory? Whose theory?
It's a theory.
Is it Freud's
theory? You're supposed to be Jewish. It's this theory, right? This theory. You're not.
You keep on saying that's the theory.
Jewish.
Like
Freud, somebody with a name like that. It's a Jewish theory, and it's proven by all that we see. And why? You explain to me then why women dote over their sons the way they do.
My mum didn't, of course. So that's the thing, all different.
I hope this isn't hurtful, what I'm saying now.
No, it's fine.
This picture of an idyllic childhood.
No, it's all comedy, as far as I'm concerned. Like, in my book, I say, which you've read, or so you claim, I say that in my book, there are many, many, many types of bad parenting that my parents did, but for me, it's not damage, it's kind of accidental sculpture, because I'm pleased with how I've turned out. So the fact that they were terrible parents in many ways, or certainly not abusive, but certainly incredibly neglectful and like just solipsistic and concerned with their own stuff, I don't care, because it's kind of brilliant and rich and strange what it led to, and that's what makes my memoir different from, say, Spare by Prince Harry. I would say. But my mum, no, I used to do a joke in stand-up, which is a rewrite, Howard will know this, of a Philip Roth joke. I used to say, my mother is a very Jewish mother. She's the sort of woman who, if I fell into a river, would shout, "Help, come quick, my son, who went to Cambridge University, is drowning." But to be honest, my mum, she did get nachas out of me, but I never got any sense that she was very bothered about sort of me, per se, or any of us. She was just living her own mad life. And she was interested, certainly in the reflected stuff, of the fame and whatever. But like, I never heard my mother say like, "Oh, I like that joke," or "What's going on there." My dad would do that a bit, you know. But so no, I don't think that my mother did dote on me. She doted a bit on my younger brother, but he's gone mad as a result of that. So not sure. I don't think that really worked out for him.
Well, you never know how it's. My mother doted on me, and I don't
And
think
you're
I've-
fine.
There's nothing wrong with me.
Yeah, you've got all these theories.
Absolutely nothing wrong with me.
But we have this, we all have this image. There's the well-known, our caricature of the Jewish mother. But there's no such widely accepted caricature of the Jewish father, is there, at all?
No.
And there's such a strikingly moving paragraph in your book where you talk about, I don't want to take the story away from you, when you lean on your father's shoulder and what he said to you.
Well, it's interesting you think that's moving. I think that's the only bit in my book where I'm actually properly critical of my parents. It's
Yeah.
interesting that you say, because I
find it heartbreaking, honestly.
Well, it's sort of I suppose it's heartbreaking. See, I don't really think about me. I thought it's heartbreaking if you're worried about me. But yeah, it was a moment that which was very. It was just typical. My dad was incredibly male. So in a way, I don't think Jewish men are that male, but my dad was. He was primarily a Welsh working class bloke, only child. His twin had died when he was very young. He'd got out of poverty by becoming a scientist, which he was then made redundant. And he was just an angry, irritated man, but saved by being funny. And also, I think, did genuinely have affection for his children in quite an angry way, but he did genuinely have all that. However, this slightly takes away from that, which is, I was about 11 or 12, and I had a sense, watching telly with my dad, and I had a sense that somewhere there was sort of straightforward affection between parents and children, perhaps in Manchester, in Howard's family, that was going on. And so I put my head on my dad's shoulder, and he went in quite a sarcastic camp voice. He went, "Oh, I didn't know you cared," right? And so that was my dad basically saying that his son putting his head on his shoulder was a bit gay. And that being gay was obviously a funny thing that you could mock and make fun of. And it bothered me quite a lot, particularly in later life, because I thought, well, maybe that's a problem between physical affection between me and my dad, and even on his deathbed, as he's closing his eyes, about to go to the great beyond, I won't be able to hold his hand in case he opens his eyes and goes, "Oh, hello, sailor." Right? That bothered me. But it's interesting because that is the only moment in the book where I think, actually, that sort of turned my heart to ash for a moment.
But it is. I agree with Stim. I think that's quite touching.
Okay, that's interesting.
So we're talking about Jewish mothers, and we've got a Jewish mother here. Claudia, what's your view of the caricature of the Jewish mother, as it were?
Yeah. My mother always said, we Sephardi women are not at all like Ashkenazi women. First of all, they didn't work, and they despised all those women who worked. Because they were supposed to be, especially those coming from Syria, they were supposed to be submissive, and they were supposed to be affectionate. They were good mothers. My mother was always telling us that she was a good mother, but showing us about all the bad mothers to compare how good she was. And she called herself a mère poule. And once when we were in London, we had a visitor from Morocco who came, who was a doctor, and he said that all his male patients who were Jewish would come when their mother died and they'd throw themselves on the wall and hit their head, and they said, "I want to die, to the doctor. And my mother was looking at my two brothers and saying, listen to that. But yes, in the way of food, we never quarreled at table because we had the codes that at table, you never disagree with your guest. The most important thing is to honor your guest. Yeah. So we weren't. But last week, I had several cousins to dinner, and my God, how they exploded and insulted each other, and actually one left. For me, nothing ever happened like that. And they were in their late 70s and mid-70s.
What was the row about? Yes. What was the broil?
Well, guess what?
Food?
No.
Oh.
what everybody's angry about now.
That was like Israel.
Yeah, but they were both left-wing
Right.
leftists.
Yeah.
I thought they would get on. They used to be loving.
Well, that brings me neatly onto, I was just about to say, before we open it up to questions, we can't have a discussion about the Jewish family without talking about Broiguses. So, Broiguses. Why is it that Jews, to my view, do Broiguses like nobody else does? What is it about Jews and their families and so on that give us that particular kind of Broiguses, as it were? Who wants to go? David?
I'm trying.
Well, I'm having a Broigus with my younger brother at the moment, but it's not. I'm going to leave that for the minute. I think because I've already accused him of being my mother's lover's son, so I should leave him out of that.
This clearly hurts a lot more than you admitting.
No, it's fine. I'm very bad. It's very unusual that I don't have Broiguses. I don't like confrontation. I tend to forgive people quickly because I can't be bothered with the confrontation and stuff like that. I remember I went out. This is the same Jewish woman. Hopefully she's not in the audience, but I went out with her for 11 years when I was 16 to 27 because basically I was too frightened to split up with her. And I remember that's also why I don't have sexual jealousy because she had an affair and left me. And I remember being overjoyed. I think finally I've got out of that relationship and I'm not the bad person. And I remember I was in therapy for quite a long time in my 30s. Not sure this is the answer. In my 30s. And I would talk about, I get into these relationships and I basically don't like confrontation, so I can't split up with people. And that's quite a problem. And after 8 years, I realised I couldn't split up with the therapist. And that was also a problem. About the only thing I could think of, like my dad, of course, being an angry man, was one for Broiguses. So my middle name is Lionel, right? And that was because I'm named after his best friend, Lionel, who's from Swansea, Lionel Elton. And Lionel was always around at our house. And then one day, in about 1981, Lionel sold my dad an Austin Princess car for 320 quid. It turned out to have a crack in the engine. My dad asked for the money back. Lionel said no. They never spoke again. And I'm still stuck with a fucking terrible middle name. But that's the only Broigus I can think of.
The only Broigus in my family was between... The biggest Broigus I can think of, apart from painful things to do with us growing, particularly my sister, reaching the difficult age when my father just lost his brain, the way many Jewish men do when their daughters become women. But leaving that aside, the biggest Broigus I can remember was over magic. My father, I've told you, was a magician, a children's magician, not a very good magician. And he decided at one point, he discovered levitation, and he thought this was absolutely brilliant. And he wanted my mother to lie on a table, and he would levitate. And for some reason, she didn't want to do that. So he came up with this idea that what he would do was he would get a doll, which he would dress in my mother's clothes. Now, I don't know where he got this doll from, but it looked suspiciously like the dolls that they sell in sex shops. Because she had a mop of false blonde hair and her mouth was open. Brilliant. So we decided, I said, Dad, if we can find a way of closing the mouth or something. So he stole some of my mother's clothes, I mean everything, underwear and everything, and dressed the doll in her. And then he was applying to be a member of the Manchester Magic Circle. And this was his act, this was his his audition. So he insisted that my mother come on. It was at a ballroom, and he insisted that my mother come along. So she came along. She was furious absolutely furious about this. She didn't, but she hadn't realised what she was going to see. She knew she was furious because he was angry with her because she wouldn't let herself be levitated. But she didn't know when she got there that she would see herself on a table. All her clothes, and my father looking very pleased with himself in his dinner jacket. There was always a bulge in his dinner jacket, and that usually meant he'd forgot to take the rabbit out from the week before. It had died in his jacket. So he got it, and he decided what he wanted to do was to... he was a bit of an inventor too, and he invented this foot pump underneath the table so that the doll would rise. off the table. He would blow the doll up. She managed to take all the air out because she was a sex balloon, really. So she was flat. And the idea was he'd pump this up and she would blow up, and then she would rise to the ceiling. So he introduced the act and so on. And my mother is still, this is me there. And he starts to do the foot pump. And the doll, which is my mother, with her mouth open, starts to rise. And the pump jams. And the doll rises and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And then it explodes. And all over the ballroom, my mother's clothes, her underwear, everything. Do you know she stormed out?
And you know she's still on the ceiling.
Like the food. Yes, it's funny. There's a lot of stuff sticking to the ceiling.
That's a brilliant story, Howard.
It's
what an
brilliant.
Extraordinary story.
Claudia?
That's a beautiful story.
So did she actually have a broigus after that with your dad, or did she forgive him
talk
for
for about 2 years.
that? Okay, that's a broigus.
That's a proper broigus, yes.
He had just one other thing I'll tell you, which I think is very Jewish.
Although he had no words, so how would she even know?
She could tell. He was upset. What would happen was he would be upset.
Yeah.
And then he'd take to drink, which meant he'd pour himself a thimble full of polwins.
Right.
And roll around drunk with this thimble full of pollen. But there's just one other thing I'll tell you while we're on his magic. It's got nothing to do with your question.
That's fine.
He did some acts for Orthodox families. And they were very keen that he did this kind of act, but not that kind of act. And finally he got an Orthodox family. He was very pleased to entertain their children, but they had hundreds of children. So this for him was an exciting gig. But they said, his name was Max, no rabbit. Please don't do anything with rabbits. And he said, why? Came to me, he said, you know, what have the Orthodox got against rabbits? It's nothing to do with the dead rabbit in his thing.
They're not kosher.
And he said, but it was more than that, because they weren't being invited to eat it. So he asked the local rabbi. The local rabbi said, I don't know. Just don't know. There's nothing halakhically against performing tricks with rabbits. So the rabbi said, I'll talk to another rabbi. So he rang up another rabbi. This went on and on and on. The Beth Din was involved and things. Finally got a very senior rabbi. I think it was it wasn't the chief rabbi of the country, but the most senior rabbi in Manchester, said, leave it to me. And he was, for about 3 weeks, we heard nothing. Then he rang my father. He said, Max, I've been looking into it. I've been looking into all the books. I've been looking into the Torah, the Talmud, Tanakh, everything. I've talked to absolutely everybody. This is my ruling. If they don't want rabbits, don't give them rabbits.
Right, let's have some questions. We've got roving microphones, so if you put up your hand, a microphone will magically arrive. In the pink hoodie.
This isn't a question, but it does relate to what you said, David. So, would you just a little story? It might resonate. I think your dad was just, he said he did this gay thing. I didn't know you felt that way because he felt embarrassed. Now, my dad wasn't a demonstrative person. He basically didn't know how to express love towards us, and for a long while I thought he didn't love me, but Mum assured me that he did. And on one occasion, this was over 40 years ago, I phoned them up one day, and I'm crying on the phone and saying, Daddy, I do love you, because I'd had a sort of like a row in the past, and you know what he says? I love you too.
That's very nice.
Yeah.
Actually, I can speak to that because it's a big deal for men of my generation, like being told that your parents love you, to say that they've said I love you, specifically dads. That's like a big deal, and it's in lots of dramas and stuff. And obviously, my dad was never going to say that. It's just not words he would say. However, he did say it, but in such a him way, which is so we did a film. Me and my brother made a film about my dad's dementia, called The Trouble with Dad. And at the end of that film, we're sitting around in his living room, and the director, trying to sort of provoke a moment really, says to me, did your dad ever tell you that he loves you? And I said, no. And the director says to me, why not? And I said, I don't think he does. And that's a joke, right? That was a joke. It's sort of, whatever. And the director then turns to my dad, puts the camera on my dad, and says, your son is saying you never loved him. And my dad, remember, coming at this from a clear dementia sky. He won't have known it's happened. He's just heard, your son is saying you never loved you. He said, that's absolute bollocks. And that's beautiful, as far as I'm concerned, because that is my dad telling me that he loves me, but entirely in his own voice. Not saying it in a Hollywood voice, saying it entirely in the only voice Colin Baddiel could ever say that. So I really, really treasure that.
Hold on a second, there's a microphone coming.
It was really something for...
Just 1 second. Can you speak into the microphone, please?
For Howard, it was just that my mother's father came from Kremenchuk in Ukraine. And when they came to this country, I remember Mum telling to, don't ever speak to a Lithuanian again, ever. And that was brought down all the way through, all the way from Ukraine to Glasgow and to me as well.
How interesting.
And also, as far as that, my wife is concerned, her mother came from Cairo in Egypt to Israel. She was of the Yemenite community. And even today, my darling wife speaks in Yemenite. She will refuse to speak to me in anything other than English and Ivrit, which unfortunately I don't speak. Finally, as far as concerned, I have to be a Glasgow Rangers supporter, much to my chagrin. But
Yes, in the yellow.
Very interesting.
In my experience, a lot of family fallouts, Bruigus, gets traced back to childhood and the feeling that parents were favouring one or more of the siblings rather than the person concerned. My father, who had 2 sons, was very keen on supposedly treating them equally. I've had 3 children and I've tried to do the same. But my perception is often different from the children's perception. And I find now one of my children claiming that he was hard done to compared with his brother and sister. It seems to me that there's a role somewhere for a Jewish family counsellor who can sort of help advise parents and make sure they are treating their children fairly and equally, and maybe some sort of certification that will help avoid Bruigus in later life.
My wife does that, and if you want to talk to me later, I'll give you the...
On? Yeah. Hello. This one. This is pertaining to Bruigus generally. I don't know if it's ever occurred to anybody that perhaps the reason why most of us, no, a lot of us, embrace Bruigus's like a duck-filled duvet is because of various things that have happened to our parents in their lives. I think the fashionable word now is microaggressions or being slighted or whatever, or this, that, and the other. You can't get back at the people who actually did it. So you, but you can kind of resolve it by getting mad basically at an empty room, as my mother is still capable of doing, even at 90. But the ultimate Bruigus, for me, I have to be a bit careful. You never know. You never know who's still still drawing breath. Anyway, good. You laugh. Oh my goodness. My dad was not her first choice. This is great. I'm loving this. my dad was not her first choice. Her first choice was under the thumb of his mother, who decided that my mother wasn't good enough for her darling son. Anyway, we fast forward.
Do you want to just come to
Yeah, I know.
bit more precise?
Yes. Okay.
Thanks.
This was going to be a broadcast that lasted a lifetime, unless you got the opportunity to do something about it. And she did. She did. Eventually, she went halfway across the world to confront this guy.
Okay, I think we've probably got.
Can I just pick up, though, something on that lady is saying?
Thank you.
Which I think is really interesting, which is, so, I don't know that much about Orthodox Judaism either, as Howard was saying earlier, but I get the sense, I wrote a book called The God Desire, which is about why people believe in God, and I think some of you may know this, is that there are many, many more atheists amongst Jews than amongst almost any other. There's something like 50% of Jews who identify as Jews also consider themselves to be atheists, which is unusual for a minority associated with religion. I myself use my atheism to get out of things that the Jewish community sometimes asks me to do. Like my local rabbi once called me up. This is true. I don't know how he got my number, presumably because we control the world, and said, will you light the menorah outside the synagogue this year? Will you be the Hanukkah local Jewish celebrity? And I didn't want to do that, so I played my trump card. I said, sorry, Rabbi, I'm an atheist. He said, so am I. I thought, fuck it. I thought there's a lot of them about. But I say this point because I think Judaism is more about, and this relates to what this lady is saying, it's sort of a religion of minutiae. To some extent, it's an OCD thing. 631 or whatever it is, 613 mitzvot. You know, a religion in which you have to put this thing around your arm, and you have to turn this light on this day, but not on this day, and say this blessing before this food, but not that food. And I think it's a religion like that because it is, like all OCD, a way of diminishing anxiety. And we diminish anxiety because we are an ethnicity or a race, however you want to put it, that has been persecuted over many years. We can't really do anything about that, so we use the magic of a minutiae-based religion in order to do it. And I think the minutiae, and this is finally getting to the point, is also there in broigasis. If you look at Curb Your Enthusiasm, Curb Your Enthusiasm, which has been called, or Seinfeld has as well, a sort of dark Talmud of sort of tiny little social misdemeanors that Larry's spotted. Yes. Things like a man who always goes to the toilet when the bill arrives. And Larry gets absolutely furious about that because he thinks that's a way of not paying the bill. And it's every episode, someone's getting furious and furious and furious about tiny things. Now, I think that's a process of safety at some level because we have seen real rage and real anger against us over many years. So if we can contain anger and rage in small minutiae and essentially make it funny by being so angry about tiny things, that's a coping mechanism.
I think you're right, and I think it's good. And I think what you said is good too. But it's very Talmudic.
Yeah, very Talmudic, yeah.
But the Talmudic stuff precedes most of our, unless you count the Babylonian exile as a major, well, I suppose it is. But don't you? I just feel it's kind of somehow or other ingrained in us before the persecution. The persecution has made it worse. It's to do with our basic relation with God, because He lets us down.
Right.
We've come up with a God that can only upset us because He isn't there.
Can I just ask you a question? There was a time before the persecution. When? Jews have always been persecuted, haven't they? Egyptians.
Adam and Eve weren't persecuted.
Yeah, they didn't exist. Though. That's the problem with them.
Well, if you're going to start, who exists? Who exists?
No, but I think, haven't Jews... I didn't really know this until I started talking about anti-Semitism. I thought, well, basically, it's Jesus. It all starts... No. It goes back long, long before Jesus. Jews were being persecuted by them.
So do you reckon, then, that it was precisely because of what was happening to us like that we came up with a God?
That's what I'm saying. This specific God that was full of little checks and balances to make us feel okay. Christianity doesn't have that because they're not being persecuted the whole time.
No, it doesn't. No, but
it's a thought.
It's a very interesting thought. But Christianity is also Judaism.
Well, that's true.
Christianity is Judaism,
but it's Judaism without the persecution.
So Christianity is the Jews deciding that they will forget the persecution or that they will
How do you...
I think after a few... I mean, to be fair, they were persecuted for a bit by the Romans, but, you know...
And the Jews.
Christians.
Jews were... the early Jews were... We weren't very pleased with having this lot.
Yeah, but persecution is when a majority culture, you know, really sits on and kills a minority culture. And that didn't happen to Christians after the 3rd century when Constantine became Christian.
So are you saying that your history is obviously much better than mine here, which is interesting considering you claim you don't know any, but are you saying that the Talmud itself is already a history of is post-persecutory?
I don't know. Well, the Talmud is, I believe, but I'm saying something which may just be wrong. It's just a thought, but that the Talmud,
the
is
Torah,
minutiae. It is really is minutiae.
It is minutiae. It's a minute criticism of the Torah. So is the Torah pre-persecutory?
I don't know. The Torah probably isn't.
Right. From that to the question at the back.
I like the theology, though.
Can we go back to the personal therapy sessions?
Yes.
I was enjoying that. You took the words out of my mouth, David. I was going to say, at what stage can your father legitimately use Larry David as an excuse for every single thing that goes wrong, his anger, his broigus? And the second related question is, can you rewrite the Success Review for some people that they would like that?
Are you haberdashers?
Oh, no. You might have guessed.
So I didn't really understand the first question. My father would never have used Larry David as an excuse, although he would have liked Larry David, I think. But I think Larry David is a much more charming version of my dad, because Larry David is furious, but he's hilarious with it. Now, my dad was actually pretty funny, but he was genuinely angry. Well, I think Larry's is a character anger about very, very small things, although there's an element of that. My dad would get furious about small things. I remember we were going over the Severn Bridge, because my dad was Welsh. We used to go to Swansea for every fucking summer holidays to Swansea. And when we were coming back over the Severn Bridge, once my mum said we had to pay £1 in those days to get over Severn Bridge. My mum said, why do we have to pay £1? And my dad just went mad at her, like furious for her not knowing why that is. And I think at some level it was because my dad was sort of an intellectual, and then he realised, you know, I haven't married an intellectual. But the thing is, I'm an intellectual. I don't know why we pay £1 to go over. I have no idea, absolutely none. So I don't know. But in terms of the second question, for anyone who doesn't know, I do talk about this in my book. This might just be between you and me, mate. I began my career in comedy, really, at Haberdashers, where there was a school review. And the school review was always rubbish. Every year, rubbish. It was just sort of twee songs about being in Elstree or whatever. I can't remember. But it would regularly get booed off, and it was terrible. And then for some reason, I don't really know why, I wasn't like the funniest kid at school at all, but I got given the job, with a couple of other blokes, of writing the 6S review. It was the kids who were going to Cambridge who got to do this show. And I made it. I said, let's do it, because I'm very interested in comedy about speaking to people about their own experience. And in a school, how do you do that? You write sketches about all the teachers that everyone hates. That's what we did. Teachers, and in our Success Review, talking about sex dolls, there was a sex doll, and the Christian librarian was having sex with the sex doll while shouting, if you want to speak in the library, you can't, which he did all the time. And stuff like that was happening throughout. I mean, teachers who everyone recognised, and it stormed it. It absolutely stormed it, and it got banned. It's still not happened. I still get kids much younger than you saying you took away the Success Review from us. So it's a weird thing, but I did think this is a great thing to be. This is why I became a comedian, because I was sort of cool at school for about 5 minutes because of that.
Yeah. I've got a question about family dynamics. So I'm a Mizrahi mother. We're very well known for doting on our youngest sons, apparently. And my son Ben says to me, you love me more, but you prefer Daisy's company. That's his sister. I wondered, my question is about the family dynamics between your siblings in your families. What did you ever feel that there was one that was favoured more than the other? And how did that affect family life?
Do you want to know how I first Do you want to know how I first saw my younger brother? I was the only child to begin with for 4 years. I had my mother's sister, my grandmother, loved everything that I did. They stood around, and if 3 people can form a circle, they formed a circle. And they clapped me, and I marched up and down, and I sang a song. They clapped me. This was when my mother said, "You've got such long legs, darling. You could be Nureyev." They absolutely adored me. And then 1 minute, suddenly I wasn't well, and I was moved out of the house and moved to my grandmother's. I wasn't allowed to see my mother for 3 weeks. And then my grandmother said, "Okay, I'm taking you for a surprise now." And she walked me down the street to my house, which I'd been banned from. And there in the window was my mother holding up this little thing, like a cup. This was like the Manchester United, holding it like that. And behind, beaming away and celebrating as though drinking champagne, was my father drinking a little mug of Polwyn's No. 5. Celebrating. And she held it like that. And my life was over. It was something in my life was essentially over. They loved him more than they could ever love me. And they tried to make it up to me, but they couldn't, because although they'd showered me with praise, the praise they'd always showered me with, "He's so clever, he's so smart, he'll be able to do this." But when this new thing arrived, it was, "Oh, isn't he beautiful, isn't he lovely?" Words I'd never heard. So let me tell you, if you're doing this with your youngest child, you're ruining the lives of others.
Claudia, do you want to talk about your family dynamics?
My family dynamic. Well, the only thing, yes, I was the middle of 2 boys. And my older brother was a phenomenon, because on the beach, we always heard on the beach in Alexandria, when he was 2, he could recite the Shema. And he went on. We all admired him. I admired him. We all admired him. And my younger brother, we adored. Yeah. So I was happy until suddenly I was at school. I was a boarder at school in Paris. I was 15, and my parents told me, "Your cousin wants to marry you." And yes, we've all agreed. And no, that cousin, I'd known him always. He was 10 years older, and he came to Paris once. It was to make sure that he wanted to marry me. We went out to dinner, and somehow we didn't get on. I thought we didn't get on, because I told him I didn't believe in God. And he said, "He's going to strike you down. He's going to kill you. Don't ever say that." So I never thought he'd wanted to marry me. But then, yes, they celebrated the engagement, and I wasn't there. I was in Paris. Well, but after that, I managed to get out of it, because the teacher, the boarding, because I was a boarder, the boarding school teacher, Madame Beaujard, said, "What's all this about you getting married?" And I said, "Well, I'm getting married." I was telling the girls, "He's got a yacht." You know, he's got a yacht. Yes. And he was one of the 18 children of the aunt. His father was my father's uncle. His mother was my father's sister, because they married very much in the family. But she got me out of it because she just said, "Do you love him?" "No." "And do you want to marry him?" She said, "Let's go and phone your mother." And we went together, and she phoned, and she told my mother, "She's not getting married. She decided with me, she's not getting married." And my mother just started screaming. She said, "Let me speak to Claudia." Claudia came to the phone, and she said, "She wants you to be an old maid like her. That's what she wants." It was screaming, because the mothers were. Then she came to Paris to try to force me to buy the trousseau, to do all these things. And I was firm, then saying no. But she didn't marry. She was the enforcer. But they went on trying to marry me off every year. There was always a suitor. And when they came here as refugees, they we were there at a family where we were staying who said, you can stay for free, all of you. And my mother, although in Egypt she has a cook and a servant and a nanny and all that, in Egypt, in London, she became a passionate cook. And because it was what she had to give. And I was in the kitchen with her. That's how I started writing down recipes. But it was very fraught because there was a suitor, a very good suitor. And so every so often, she would start again, and things like, if you don't accept, I'll throw myself out of the window. If you don't accept, I'll cut my throat. You see? So I was used to that. But you see, the years later, my mother died before my father, and he said, you know, it wasn't your mother pressuring you always for the bad things, but she did it because I told her. You see, the fathers were always the good guys. We all adored our fathers. I adored my father, but everybody in Egypt adored him. First of all, his family, because he was the youngest of 10, all girls who all adored him. How could he not be adorable? And he was. And so, yes, so in many ways, my mother was the intellectual. She read hundreds of books in French and English. She read all the detective stories as well, but she couldn't work. She couldn't work because it would shame my father. All the women that I knew of her generation didn't work because it would shame their husbands. You couldn't. And yes, and so this was the dynamic that, and also for me, they wouldn't let me go to university. I wanted to go. After school in Paris, I wanted to do film studies, to do science, because I was studying at things. No, because you become unmarriageable if you're too clever. And so art school was good because a girl who plays the piano or paints is desirable. And so I accepted it because I loved them in some way.
Thank you.
Should we not have one more question?
Yeah, we can come. We can.
How long is this evening going on for?
Till about
next
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
Another 10 minutes or so.
Okay.
10 minutes.
Okay. Well, siblings. I mean, I've talked about them a bit. My older brother. My memoir is dedicated to my older brother, Ivor Baddiel, who is the member of my family I most unconditionally love. He basically, Ivor is responsible for my sanity, I think, because it's actually like Freud. One of the many things that's wrong with Freud is that he's created an assumption that one is entirely formed psychologically by your parents, whether they're good or bad parents, and that takes no account of siblings. And I would say my brother, Ivor, was much more my parent than my parents. My parents were not parents. They were people who were off doing their own stuff. And that was quite common at the time anyway. Jerry Seinfeld does this joke about, you know, if you were being a child in the 1960s and 70s, as far as your parents were concerned, is a bit like being a raccoon, in the sense that you know there's one around here somewhere, but you've got no idea where it is, and you're certainly not tracking it. And my parents were like that. They didn't know where we were. I mean, later in life, when I wrote the book, some amazing things that I had to check. Like, I got arrested on a weird demonstration. I wasn't really bothered about the demonstration. I'd gone down there because I thought it might be a laugh. I got arrested by the police and put in a cell for a while, and then tried for obstructing the police in the course of their duty and obstructing the highway. I got away with it. It's quite a long story, but when I was writing it, I thought, my parents weren't there. They didn't come to the trial. Like, I might have gone down for about 3 months. They might at least have sort of waved me goodbye, but no. And I couldn't really believe this. And the thing is, I used to have massive, great goth hair when I was 19 or 20 when this happened, or 21 when this happened, and I'd had it pinned up. Because I was so narcissistic then, I wouldn't have it cut. But I had it pinned up so that I looked a bit more respectable. And I phoned my girlfriend, Janine Kaufman. She's had a starring role tonight. Janine Kaufman, my Jewish girlfriend, to check this story. I said, did my parents really not come to my trial when I might have gone to prison? And she said, no, I know this because I was there. They weren't there. I was the one who pinned your hair up. which I think is that's heartbreaking, I think. But however, when I think about why I'm sane, it's because Ivor looked after me. I went to Haberdashers, which was miles away from Dollis Hill, so I had to get up and get the tube. I used to get up at like 6:30 to catch the early coach, because my parents weren't prepared to pay for the later coach, which you had to pay more for. So I'm up at 6:30 to go on the fucking Bakerloo line from Dollis Hill to Stanmore, and they didn't get up. Ivor cooked my breakfast, right, for me. And this makes me want to cry, how much Ivor, when he's 12, is looking after me when I'm 11. And so I dedicated my book to him. Then I thought I should probably dedicate it to Dan, who's my younger brother as well. Now, Dan was doted on by my mother, as I said. It's a very interesting thing you said, by the way. Fascinating thing you said about how your son says that you loved him the most, but prefers Daisy's company. I think the thing I take from that is how expressed are Jewish men. Right? Because you hear all the time that men can't express their emotions. Not Jewish men. Jewish men are never not expressing their emotions, except from people like my dad and Howard's dad. But modern Jewish men endlessly taking the line of like, well, we're in therapy so we can express our emotions. But anyway, I thought I'd better dedicate it to my younger brother as well. But my younger brother was not involved in my sanity at all. I think of my older brother as someone who I would probably not be around if he wasn't here to sort of buffer the madness of my family home.
The powers that be tell me that we don't, in fact, have time for
I told
another
you.
question.
They want another question. They don't want to hear me go banging on about.
No, they wanted to hear you, David.
Okay.
So, first of all, just a
Can
reminder.
I tell just one final story?
Yes, of course.
Just, otherwise you're going to wrap up.
I was told no more questions, no more from the panel.
Okay, one more final story.
Can I have a story to top his finals?
Yeah,
all right.
And me.
So we can have three final stories. Yes.
I wish I had started now.
Brief final stories.
Okay, so this is a story, because we have been quite expressed about Jewish shame. Because we are, I think, quite expressive about our Jewishness. Certainly, Howard was talking about how his career, to some extent, and how he thinks is about expressing what it means to be a Jew. But not all Jews are like this. And I realised this when I wrote Jews Don't Count, and Jews would write to me and say, I've spent my whole life not telling people I'm Jewish, and, and I'm trying to read this book to try and find a way of talking, and blah, blah, blah. There are lots of Jews in the closet, and whatever. And my best example of that is in 1999, it's football again, I was doing a show called Fantasy Football with Frank Skinner, and we were interviewed at Wembley for the FA Cup final that day. You'll know the FA Cup final is on a Saturday, by a man called Jim Rosenthal. Now, some of you will remember Jim Rosenthal, and Jim Rosenthal I used to see on the telly, and I was quite excited. I thought, he's definitely Jewish. Oh, it's a Jew on the telly. You never see them. That's brilliant. When I was a kid. So when I met him, when he interviewed me in 1999, he's asking us questions, and I try a joke. I say, Jim, should you be working on Shabbos? Right? And that gets not much of a laugh tonight, but no laugh then. Jim is furious and says, stop the filming, I'm not Jewish. I get out of that, he says. Can you imagine any other minority saying this in a world of empowerment? He says, I get out of that because of my mum. So I learned then Jim Rosenthal's dad is Jewish, Mr. Rosenthal. His mum isn't, so he's very keen to tell us all that he's not Jewish. It's incredibly embarrassing and awkward. Frank is pissed off with me because he's done 4 jokes. He has to do them again. It's all very embarrassing. Then, here's the end of the story. Cut to 2002. I'm in Japan for the World Cup, where I've gone to write about the World Cup and watch the World Cup. And in Japan, some of you may know, there's often a big spa area at the bottom of your hotel. And I go down to the bottom of my hotel, and there's a sauna in this spa area, and it's naked in Japan, so I think, I don't mind, I'm going in there. I go in, and in the middle of the sauna, on his own, naked, is Jim Rosenthal. And I tell you what, he fucking is Jewish.
Claudia?
No, I'll stop. This is too good.
I'm happy to go out on that, but Howard thinks he can top it.
I don't tell circumcision jokes. But I'll just tell you one thing. The fact that you saying, what was it? Who's saying no more of this? Stop the... Who said stop?
Jim Rosenthal.
Saying stop the filming.
Stop the filming,
When
I'm
you
not
said
Jewish.
that, I saw my father saying, stop the train. Stop the train. And this was because when I was 18 years old and I was going to university to Cambridge, And I was thinking, finally, I can get away from... Funny I'm saying this now, because what am I getting away from since I've been telling you how wonderful it all was? My father did control a lot more of my life than I've admitted, because he was the kind of man who always saw an accident or a calamity. If there was a burning house, my father would see it before anybody else. He would run in and he would bring out 4 or 5 people on his shoulders. And he'd always say to me, Lozine, don't have anything to do, you stay there. If we saw a car crash, my father would rip off the doors of the car and pull out the dead passenger. Don't look at this. He was always covering my eyes, saving me from life. He saved me from life. That was his job, from the rough experience of life. And then finally I'm thinking, I'm going to Cambridge. This is fantastic. I can live my own life. He takes me to Piccadilly Station. He puts me in the compartment. He sits me down in a seat. He puts my case, because he's now being my kind of valet, and I'm thinking, this is going to be over soon. I can now live my own life. He puts the case on the luggage deck, bangs me on the shoulder, because that's what we used to do then for hugging. No idea what I was... Then he said, where are you going again? I said, I'm going to university. All right. And suddenly he says, get up. He said goodbye to me. He said, get up. So I said, all right, get up. And he tells everybody in the compartment, get up and get out of the train. He goes to the door, stands on the platform and shouts, porter, porter. This train was about to go in about 5 minutes. Stops the whole thing. What had happened was he'd sat me down opposite a dead person. For the first time in my life, it was available to me to deal with matters of life and death and the beginning of my life, and my father... I'm not going to say, you say the fucking... My father controlled it. That's my story.
Yeah. On that note, so just a reminder that there are books for sale over there and you can get them signed. And I would just like to say, for a chairman, an event like this is just a dream. Because all you have to do is basically sit and press a button and off come the stories and off it goes. And it's been a joy for me, and I'm sure it's been a joy for you as well. So on your behalf, David, Claudia, Howard, thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Lovely. Hold on, guys.